The chow lines stretched across the yard, boots grinding into the sun-baked dirt of Fort Carson. The heat made tempers short and jokes cut sharper than usual. Private First Class Isabella Reyes stood in line like everyone else, sleeves rolled just above the wrist. That was all it took. The hummingbird tattoo on her forearm caught the eye of a group of infantry Marines behind her. One smirked loud enough for the others to hear. "What's she gonna do? Flutter at the enemy?" Laughter broke out, a ripple of amusement at her expense. Isabella didn't flinch. She didn't turn. She just kept her eyes forward, tray steady in her hands. Silence her only defense. They thought they knew who she was. They didn't. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Private First Class Isabella Reyes was 28 years old, assigned to the Logistics Division at Fort Carson. Her world wasn't firefights or night raids. It was clipboards, manifests, and endless stacks of supply reports. While others trained for combat, she made sure they had the gear to survive it. Every morning she arrived early, boots polished to a mirror shine. Her bunk was squared away, paperwork flawless. She never raised her voice, never complained, never cut corners. If a shipment was missing, Isabella found it. If her report was late, Isabella had already finished it the night before. But in the eyes of most infantry Marines, none of that mattered. To them, she wasn't a fighter, wasn't real corps. She was just another supply clerk, someone they didn't picture in the field, someone whose quiet presence could be overlooked without a second thought. The contrast was sharp. The men who mocked her were loud, brash, convinced that worth was measured in calluses and combat patches. Isabella was the opposite. Soft-spoken, steady, humble. She didn't brag about past accomplishments. She didn't push back when jokes were thrown her way. She simply endured them. And then there was the tattoo. A single hummingbird, black ink spread across the pale skin of her forearm. To most, it looked like something out of place on a Marine. Feminine, fragile, a decoration that didn't belong beside a uniform and dog tags. In the chow hall, whispers always started when someone noticed it. She got that on spring break, someone would mutter, "What you gonna do?" Flap her wings at the Taliban. The laughter that followed never seemed to touch her. Isabella never explained. Not once. She kept her sleeves rolled just high enough that the ink was always visible. Whether it was stubbornness, pride, or something else entirely, no one knew. But she never defended it, never offered a story, never gave them what they wanted. To her fellow Marines, it was a joke. To Isabella Reyes, it was something else entirely. The first time it happened in front of a formation, Isabella told herself it didn't matter. They were standing in the yard for a routine briefing when a platoon sergeant caught sight of her tattoo. He smirked, then turned to the entire group. "Look at this," he said, grabbing her wrist and holding it up for everyone to see. "Private Reyes here thinks she's at a hummingbird garden. What's this supposed to be, Reyes? Your spirit animal." A ripple of laughter moved through the ranks. Isabella didn't pull her arm back. She just let the silence sit, eyes locked forward, jaw tight. The sergeant eventually dropped her wrist and moved on, but the damage lingered. To everyone watching, she was fair game. It spread to the motor pool. One hot afternoon, two Marines leaned against a Humvee, cigarettes dangling from their lips, watching her walk past with a clipboard. "I'll put 20 on it," one said loud enough for her to hear. She couldn't even load this truck without breaking a nail. The other chuckled. "You're on." No way she even knows where the tie-down points are. Isabella kept walking. She didn't flinch, didn't fire back. But in the reflection of the Humvee's side mirror, her eyes burned for just a moment before softening again. She disappeared into the warehouse, and the laughter followed her. It got worse in the chow hall. She balanced her tray, careful as always, when a private brushed past too close. The tray slipped. Metal clattered against the floor. Food scattered across the tiles. The hall erupted. Some jeered. One clapped sarcastically. "Nice work, Reyes. Enemy's going to surrender now, for sure." Isabella knelt, picking up the pieces one by one. No curse words, no anger, just steady hands, slow breaths, and silence. A medic bent down to help her, but she shook her head. She didn't want pity. She finished cleaning, left her tray behind, and sat at a corner table alone. That became her routine, alone at meals. Alone at the supply desk long after others had gone to their bunks. The lights in her office burned late, her pens scratching across paper. When Marines passed by, they saw her hunched over letters sealed in neat stacks, but never mailed. No one knew who she wrote to. No one asked. The silence might have swallowed her whole, if not for the visiting unit. One afternoon, a convoy rolled through Fort Carson, dust clouds trailing the arrival of a Marine Force recon detachment, rotating through for joint training. Hardened men stepped off the vehicles, weapons slung, eyes scanning. They noticed everything. And when they noticed Isabella Reyes being mocked at the edge of the yard, when they saw the way laughter followed her like a shadow that didn't laugh, they just watched, studied. Something about her, something about that ink on her forearm caught their attention. They didn't say a word. Not yet. But from that moment on, Isabella wasn't just invisible. She was being observed. The days blurred into one another at Fort Carson. For most, it was routine. For Isabella Reyes, it was a test of endurance, not of combat, but of silence. Yet every now and then, cracks in the image she presented would show. Little things, subtle, but impossible to ignore if someone paid close attention. The first clue appeared one evening when a private walked past the women's barracks. Isabella's locker door was open. A single photo taped inside. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A group of Marines standing shoulder to shoulder in the desert. But the faces were blurred, either by dust or deliberate smudging. Only one detail stood out. A patch on a sleeve half covered, but distinct to anyone who knew special operations. The private lingered, squinting. But before he could study it further, Isabella closed the locker with quiet finality. The second clue lay in her tattoo itself. Under the harsh floodlights of the motor pool, the hummingbird ink revealed more than wings. Thin lines cut through the design, barely visible, weaving numbers into the pattern. Coordinates, unit digits, something precise, hidden in plain sight. The Marines who laughed at her never noticed, but a visiting force recon operator leaning against a Humvee caught it one night. His gaze lingered. His expression changed. He didn't say a word, but when Isabella noticed his eyes on her arm, she tugged her sleeve down without a sound. The third came in the warehouse. A shipment arrived late, crates of weapons fresh off the line. Armorers gathered around, prying lids open, cataloging serials. Isabella, clipboard in hand, stepped forward. She rattled off the model, weight, and specs of each rifle before the men even finished unsealing the cases. Reyes, one of them said, staring. "How the hell do you know that?" She just shrugged. "It's on the manifest," she replied, though they all knew the paperwork hadn't even been touched yet. These are not accidents. They were fragments of a life Isabella never talked about, buried beneath the surface. The men who mocked her saw only silence and a hummingbird. The ones who looked closer saw shadows of something else, something far more dangerous. The inspection came without warning. Late one afternoon, word spread that a lieutenant was making surprise rounds through the motor pool. Marines scrambled to make order out of chaos, tightening straps, wiping grease, lining gear in perfect rows. Isabella Reyes stood quietly at her desk, clipboard at the ready. The lieutenant's gaze swept the room. His eyes landed on her. "You," he said, pointing. Private Reyes stepped forward. The room stilled. Isabella obeyed, boots clicking against the concrete floor. The lieutenant picked up an M4 carbine from a nearby rack and held it out. "Your logistics, right? Paperwork, supplies. Let's see what you really know." A murmur rippled through the Marines. This wasn't a fair test. Everyone knew Reyes wasn't combat arms, but Isabella didn't hesitate. She accepted the weapon with steady hands. "Disassemble it," the lieutenant ordered. Isabella looked at the weapon once, then set it on the table. Without a word, she reached in her pocket and pulled a strip of cloth. She tied it around her eyes, blindfolding herself. Gasps filled the motor pool. Her fingers moved with quiet precision. Bon, folding bean, et jato. Piece by piece, she laid the weapon out in perfect order. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The clicking of metal against the table was the only sound in the room. In less than 2 minutes, the M4 lay stripped bare before her. The armorer, standing nearby, folded his arms. "I've seen guys take 5 times that long," he muttered. Isabella pulled the blindfold off, blinked once, and began reassembling the weapon. The final click of the magazine echoed like a hammer strike in the silence. When she slid the rifle back across the table, the lieutenant's expression was unreadable. From the back of the room, a voice broke the silence. "Damn." Isabella didn't smile. She didn't explain. She just lifted her clipboard again as if the demonstration had never happened. "It's all in the manual, Sergeant," she said softly. But everyone in that motor pool knew better. Her secret was cracking through, and no one could make sense of it. The convoy rolled into Fort Carson just after dawn, tires grinding against the tarmac, heat already rising from the ground. A Marine Force recon detachment stepped out, disciplined, silent, carrying the weight of operations most would never know. At the front of them walked their commander, a man seasoned by decades of service. Isabella Reyes stood off to the side, clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled high as always. She was unnoticed, just another figure in tan fatigues. She wrote down tail numbers, checked manifests, and kept her head low. The commander's gaze swept the yard, sharp and searching, and then he froze. His eyes locked on Isabella's arm. The Hummingbird. He stopped walking. The operators behind him halted too, boots falling quiet on the blistering concrete. The commander stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Isabella looked up, startled but didn't move. Her fingers tightened around her clipboard. Then, without a word, the Force Recon commander straightened his shoulders and lifted his hand in a crisp salute. The air shifted instantly. Marines nearby froze in place. Their trays, their tools, their words cut short. Silence spread across the yard like a wave. A whisper slipped through the ranks. "Why is he saluting a clerk?" No one dared laugh now. The commander's voice carried low but firm. "You're still with us, Reyes." She gave the smallest nod. And just like that, the truth cracked open. Isabella Reyes was no ordinary supply clerk. Years earlier, she had served as an embedded intelligence officer on a mission so classified that most records didn't exist. Her call sign was never spoken aloud. Her tattoo was never decoration. That hummingbird ink was a mark known only to a handful of men alive, survivors of an operation where Reyes's intel had saved dozens of Force Recon Marines from certain death. The symbol had been worn in silence by those who had come back, and the commander standing before her had been one of them. He held the salute, and for the first time since she arrived at Fort Carson, every mocking voice fell quiet. The salute hung in the air, unbroken, a moment stretched tight with silence. Then the Force Recon commander lowered his hand and turned to the gathered Marines. His voice carried steady, but weighted with memory. "You think she's just a clerk?" he asked. "You think that tattoo is a joke?" No one answered. No one dared. The commander's gaze swept the formation. "Years ago, in a valley most of you will never hear about, we were trapped, outnumbered, pinned down, minutes from being wiped out. The only reason I'm standing here, the only reason any of us made it home was her." He pointed to Isabella. She stood frozen, caught between humility and dread, her clipboard pressed tight against her chest. She wasn't on the ground with a rifle. She wasn't pulling a trigger. But the intel she fed us, the route she found, the code she cracked, the call she made in the dark, it turned the tide. My men lived because of her. A hush fell deeper over the yard. The Marines who had mocked her in the chow line shifted uncomfortably, shame in their eyes. The commander stepped back toward Isabella. He raised his hand again, crisp, sharp, unmistakable. This time, the salute wasn't just his. One by one, the Force Recon operators behind him followed. Then the Marine officers. Then enlisted Marines who had once laughed at her tattoo. Boots snapped together, hands rose to brows, the air electric with respect. Isabella's throat tightened. She didn't smile. She didn't break. She returned the salute with a quiet steadiness that shook them all the more. For a heartbeat, hardened warriors saluted the woman they had dismissed. The Hummingbird ink that had been a target of mockery was now a banner of sacrifice and survival. It was the kind of moment that no one on that base would ever forget. When the salute ended, the yard stayed silent. No one spoke. No one moved, as if breaking the moment would be a kind of disrespect. The Force Recon commander lowered his hand. His voice softened. You've earned more than silence, Reyes. They should know who stands among them. Isabella shook her head gently. Her words were barely above a whisper. I'm just doing my job, sir. And that was the end of it. No grand speech. No demand for recognition. Just the same quiet discipline she had always shown. From that day forward, no one mocked her. No one joked about the hummingbird ink on her arm. The men who had laughed now stood a little straighter when she walked past, their voices quieter, their eyes respectful. In time, stories spread, whispers of what she had done, fragments of truth carried from one Marine to another. She never confirmed them, never corrected them. She didn't need to. Isabella Reyes became a quiet legend at Fort Carson, not because she sought it, but because respect had finally found her. The immediate aftermath was electric with tension. Marines who had jeered at her in the chow hall now couldn't meet her eyes. The private who had knocked her tray to the floor approached hesitantly, his face flushed with shame. Ma'am, he stammered, using the respectful address for the first time. I want to apologize for my behavior. I had no idea who you were. Isabella regarded him with calm eyes. You shouldn't need to know someone's background to treat them with basic respect, she replied quietly. The words hit harder than any anger could have. The Marine nodded, understanding the lesson embedded in her gentle correction. Around the yard, conversations had shifted from mockery to curiosity, then to something deeper. The platoon sergeant who had grabbed her wrist in formation stood at attention when she passed, offering a crisp nod of acknowledgement. The armorers who had questioned her weapons knowledge now sought her input on technical specifications. Even the lieutenant who had tested her with a blindfolded disassembly approached with newfound respect. Reyes, he said formally, I misjudged your capabilities. Your demonstration was exemplary. Isabella accepted his words with the same quiet grace she had shown under mockery. Thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate proper procedures. Her response was measured, professional, containing no hint of vindication or triumph. She had never sought to prove herself through dramatic displays. The revelation of her past had simply made visible what had always been there. The Force Recon commander lingered after his men had dispersed to their quarters. He approached Isabella as she returned to her desk, clipboard once again in hand. The tattoo, he said quietly. Operation Hummingbird. Few people know that name. Fewer still earn the right to wear that ink. Isabella's fingers unconsciously touched her forearm where the design lay beneath her sleeve. It was a long time ago, sir. Different life. Not different, the commander corrected gently. Hidden. There's a distinction. He studied her with the eyes of someone who had seen too much war and recognized its mark on others. You saved 18 Marines that day. My Marines. The intelligence you provided, the routes you mapped, the enemy positions you identified, they turned a death trap into a fighting chance. Isabella's composure wavered slightly, memories flickering behind her calm exterior. Sir, I was just doing my assigned mission. The commander shook his head. No, Reyes. What you did went far beyond assignment. When the communications went dark and the extraction failed, you stayed. You continued transmitting coordinates even when enemy forces were closing on your position. You held that overwatch until every last Marine was clear. Her throat tightened imperceptibly. Someone had to maintain the link, sir. It was the tactical requirement. But the cost, he pressed quietly. The shrapnel that ended your field career. The months of recovery that kept you out of action. The reassignment to logistics that buried your real service record. You paid a price for keeping us alive. Isabella straightened, her professional mask sliding back into place. The Corps takes care of its own, sir. I'm honored to continue serving in whatever capacity is needed. Around them, the normal bustle of base life continued, but their conversation existed in a bubble of shared understanding. Other Marines passed by, now offering respectful nods instead of dismissive glances. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The commander reached into his pocket and withdrew a small metal object. A challenge coin, matte black with silver details. On one side, the Force Recon emblem. On the other, a hummingbird in flight surrounded by coordinates that only she would recognize. "This belongs to you," he said, pressing it into her palm. "We had them made after Operation Hummingbird. Every Marine who came home carries one. You should have received yours years ago." Isabella stared at the coin, its weight heavier than the metal should have been. The coordinates etched around the hummingbird marked the exact position where she had provided Overwatch, where she had transmitted the intelligence that saved lives at the cost of her own career prospects. "Sir," she began, but he held up a hand. "No arguments, Reyes. Some debts can never be repaid, only acknowledged. This is acknowledgement." She closed her fingers around the coin, feeling its edges press into her palm. "Thank you, sir," she said simply. The words carried weight beyond their brevity. As word of the encounter spread through Fort Carson, the transformation rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Marines who had witnessed the salute carried the story to their units. The tale grew in the telling, but the core remained unchanged. Isabella Reyes was not who they had thought she was. In the mess hall that evening, the atmosphere was different. When Isabella entered with her tray, conversations didn't stop, but they shifted. Marines straightened in their seats. Some nodded respectfully. Others simply watched with new understanding. The corner table where she usually sat alone was no longer isolated. A staff sergeant approached hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said formally, "would you consider joining our table? We'd be honored by your presence." Isabella studied his face, seeing genuine respect rather than pity or curiosity. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'd be happy to join you." As she settled among them, the conversation was subdued but warm. These were Marines who had learned something important about assumptions and respect. They asked no probing questions about her past, offered no false familiarity. They simply included her as they should have from the beginning. The change extended beyond individual interactions. Orders came down from the commanding officer that afternoon. All personnel would receive mandatory training on recognizing and respecting diverse service backgrounds. The official language was diplomatic, but everyone understood the real message. The treatment of Isabella Reyes had exposed a failure in unit cohesion that would not be tolerated. In her quarters that night, Isabella sat on her bunk, examining the challenge coin. Under the lamplight, the etched hummingbird seemed to hover above the coordinates, frozen in perpetual flight. She thought of the Marines she had helped save, wondering where they were now, whether they carried similar coins, whether they remembered the voice on the radio that had guided them to safety. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief, but loaded with meaning. "Hummingbird Actual, this is Devil Dog 6. Heard you surfaced at Carson. 18 souls still breathing because of you. Semper Fi." She stared at the screen for a long moment before typing her reply. "Mission complete. Glad you made it home. Semper Fi." The exchange was simple, professional, but it carried the weight of shared experience that civilians could never fully understand. These were the bonds forged in extremity, tested by fire, and proven unbreakable by time or distance. The next morning brought a new reality to Fort Carson. Isabella arrived at her desk to find a stack of requests waiting for her review. Equipment assessments, tactical gear recommendations, logistical planning for upcoming exercises. Her expertise was suddenly in demand from units across the base. A captain from the intelligence section approached her workspace. "Reyes," he said respectfully, "we're planning a training exercise that requires coordination between ground units and support elements. Your experience with embedded operations would be invaluable for scenario development." Isabella looked up from her paperwork, considering the request. "I'd be happy to provide input, sir. What's the operational framework?" As they discussed tactical scenarios, other Marines gathered nearby, not intruding, but clearly interested in her professional insights. Her quiet voice carried authority now, each suggestion weighted with the credibility of proven experience. The same weapons knowledge that had once seemed inexplicable was now sought after for training programs. The Force Recon commander stopped by her desk later that morning. "Reyes," he said, "I've spoken with your commanding officer about a possible reassignment. Your skills are being wasted in routine logistics." She shook her head politely. "Sir, I appreciate the consideration, but I'm content with my current duties. Every role in the Corps serves a purpose." Her response reflected the same humility that had defined her throughout the ordeal. She sought no elevation, no special treatment based on her revealed background. The work itself was reward enough. But her influence was undeniable. Young Marines began approaching her with questions about professionalism, about maintaining standards under pressure, about finding purpose in service regardless of recognition. She answered each inquiry with patience and wisdom, becoming an unofficial mentor to those who recognized her example. During afternoon weapons maintenance, the armorer who had once questioned her knowledge now deferred to her expertise. "Reyes," he asked, showing her a technical manual. "This modification specification seems inconsistent with operational requirements. What's your assessment?" Isabella examined the documentation carefully. "The manual's correct for standard configurations," she replied. "But in field conditions, that modification creates reliability issues. I'd recommend the alternative mounting system for better durability." Her technical knowledge, no longer mysterious, was now valued for its precision and practical application. The transformation was complete, but subtle. She received no formal promotion, no dramatic change in duties. Instead, respect had quietly replaced mockery, consultation had replaced dismissal, and inclusion had replaced isolation. Weeks passed, and the story of Isabella Reyes became woven into the fabric of Fort Carson. New arrivals heard it during orientation, a cautionary tale about assumptions and respect. Veterans told it to remind themselves that heroism often wore quiet faces and spoke in measured voices. The mess hall, where she had once eaten alone, now welcomed her at any table. The motor pool, where her expertise had been questioned, now sought her input on complex technical issues. The supply warehouse that had been her refuge became a classroom where she taught efficiency and attention to detail. But perhaps the most significant change was in the Marines themselves. The culture of casual mockery that had once defined interactions began to shift towards something more professional, more respectful. Isabella's example had demonstrated that strength came in many forms, that service records could be deceiving, and that true warriors sometimes carried their battles in silence. A young private fresh from boot camp approached her one afternoon. "Ma'am," he said nervously, "I heard about your service, about what you did for those Marines. I was wondering if you could tell me how to be a better Marine." Isabella set down her clipboard and gave him her full attention. "What's your name, Marine?" "Private Garcia, ma'am." He stood straighter under her gaze. "Well, Private Garcia, being a better Marine starts with remembering why you took the oath. It's not about recognition or advancement. It's about serving something larger than yourself and taking care of the Marines beside you." She gestured toward the busy yard around them. "Every person here has a role to play. Respect that role, respect the person filling it, and always remember that you never know what battle someone else has fought." Garcia nodded seriously, absorbing the lesson. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your time." As he walked away, Isabella returned to her paperwork, unaware that their conversation had been overheard by several other Marines. Her words would be repeated, her example would be remembered, and her influence would ripple outward in ways she could never measure. The Force Recon unit completed their training rotation and prepared to depart Fort Carson. Their commander sought out Isabella for a final conversation. "Reyes," he said, extending his hand, "it's been an honor serving alongside you again, even briefly." "The sentiment is mutual, sir," she replied, accepting the handshake. "Thank you for reminding everyone here what true service looks like." He smiled slightly. "I think you managed that just fine on your own." As the convoy departed, Isabella watched from her office window. She thought about the young Marines she had mentored, the respect she had earned, and the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. The challenge coin remained in her pocket, a reminder not of glory, but of responsibility. She carried it not as a trophy, but as a promise to continue serving with the same quiet dedication that had defined her career. Months later, a new group of Marines arrived at Fort Carson. Fresh from training, eager to prove themselves, carrying the same swagger and assumptions that had once characterized the base culture. But they found something different waiting for them. During their first week, one of the newcomers noticed Isabella's hummingbird tattoo and started to make a joke. Before the words could leave his mouth, a senior Marine grabbed his arm. "Don't," the veteran said quietly. "That's Isabella Reyes. She's earned more respect than you'll see in your entire career." The newcomer looked confused. "But she's just supply," he protested. The senior Marine shook his head. "No, Marine. She's exactly who we all should aspire to be." The story was told again, passed down like military tradition. Not as legend, but as lesson. Not as entertainment, but as education. Isabella Reyes had become more than a person at Fort Carson. She had become a standard, a reminder that heroism often wore humble faces and spoke in quiet voices. In her small office, Isabella continued her work with the same meticulous attention to detail that had always defined her service. She answered questions from young Marines, provided expertise to senior officers, and maintained the supply systems that kept the base functioning. Her letters, once unmailed and mysterious, now found their destinations. Thank you notes to families of fallen comrades, encouragement to wounded warriors in recovery, quiet correspondence that maintained the bonds forged in service. The hummingbird tattoo on her arm was no longer hidden beneath rolled sleeves. She wore it openly now, not as decoration, but as identification, a mark that spoke to those who understood its meaning while serving as a reminder to others that appearances could deceive and assumptions could wound. True strength, she had learned, wasn't found in avoiding mockery, but in maintaining dignity despite it. Real courage wasn't displayed in dramatic moments, but demonstrated in daily choices to serve with honor regardless of recognition. And genuine heroism lived not in the retelling of past glories, but in the quiet commitment to continue serving something greater than oneself. At Fort Carson, they no longer laughed at the tattoo. They understood it represented something far more powerful than any jest could diminish, something that demanded respect, inspired service, and reminded every Marine that real warriors came in many forms. Moral: true strength isn't loud. Sometimes the quietest warrior carries the deepest scars and the highest honors.